Thank you so much for having me here today. My name is Lisa O'Brien, and I'm a postdoctoral research fellow in the Department of Psychological Sciences at Rice University. And while I'm currently based in psychology, my background is in behavioral ecology and collective animal behavior, and it shaped my perspective on the current work that I'm conducting with humans. And so I'm going to be talking today about approaching studies of collective intelligence in human teams from the perspective of animal swarm intelligence. All right. So collective intelligence has been defined as intelligence which involves group rather than individual mental effort. In contrast to overall performance, the term collective intelligence describes the increase in effectiveness that team members gain by working together. For example, a team of poor performers could display high collective intelligence if they perform better than they could when they were on their own. While a team of high performers may display low collective intelligence if they don't gain much by working together. Thus, how team members combine their cognitive resources may be just as or even more important to the emergence of collective intelligence than their cognitive resources themselves. Communication is an important component of teamwork that can facilitate the sharing, combination, and organization of individual knowledge, ideas, and perspectives. Within industrial organizational psychology, it's often examined within the framework of the input-process-output model. This model conceptualizes how team processes, such as communication, mediate the relationship between inputs and team outputs. For example, researchers may examine how inputs, such as the personalities of team members, the size of the team, or the nature of the task relate to the quality of team communication, and how the quality of communication relates to team performance, collective intelligence, or team satisfaction. Data on communication or other team processes may summarize team interactions at the end of the study or be sampled at a few points throughout through the use of self-report methods or observation. Studies using these methods have provided important insights into the role communication plays in collective intelligence and team performance. For example, communication is positively related to team performance. Communication is more important for tasks that are complex and interdependent. And information elaboration is more important than information or knowledge sharing. However, shortcomings of these methods are that they're incapable of capturing important dynamics of a team's communication processes over time, and how these dynamics relate to both input and output variables. During a conversation, each individual speaking behaviors both shape and react to the behavior of other individuals. For example, this is a visualization of a real conversation between three speakers, with each colored bar representing the timing and duration of their speaking turns. This coordinated process is shaped by both implicit rules of conversational turn-taking, as well as individual variation in speaking behaviors. For example, dominance level has been found to correlate with total speaking time and likelihood of interruption, and in mixed-sex pairs, men talk more than women regardless of relative dominance. Thus, team members' communication behaviors may combine in complex ways to shape the structure of interactions between them, which can then shape how their contributions are converted to team outputs. Indeed, there's evidence that communication dynamics play an important role in team performance and collective intelligence. For example, total speaking time may be connected to leadership. And centralization of speaking around a dominant team member may negatively impact skill utilization of other team members. And similarly, unequal speaking time can negatively impact team performance outcomes. So studying the structure of communication processes, even with no or minimal content, has the potential to shed light on important interaction mechanisms underlying the emergence of collective intelligence. In this regard, studies of swarm intelligence can provide inspiration for this approach. The term swarm intelligence is typically reserved for intelligent group behaviors that emerge in a self-organized manner. It is often used to describe intelligent feats performed by relatively simple individuals, such as social insects. Honeybee nest site selection is one of the best studied animal models for collective decision-making that emphasizes the key role of communication between group members. Swarms of honeybees are capable of consistently choosing the best nest site out of a set of options, and this process is facilitated through interactions between group members. For example, the waggle dance shares information about potential nest sites. Dance intensity correlates with site quality. And this information impacts recruitment, where more individuals are recruited to higher quality sites. And then hive transfer is triggered when a quorum is reached of scouts at one particular site. So significant progress has been made in understanding examples of swarm intelligence, such as honeybee nest site selection, by combining theoretical models with detailed empirical studies. For example, agent-based models are used to connect local interaction rules to group-level properties. This graph shows the result of a model connecting individual dancing behaviors to the number of scouts that arrive at a given nest site. Furthermore, empirical studies can be used to test whether real behaviors align with models, for example, by continuously tracking dancing behavior within the hive. And the process of group consensus decision-making can be studied in detail over time. And the outcomes of empirical studies can be compared to theoretical predictions and used to improve future model development. In addition, validated models can be used to examine how variation in model parameters impact outcomes, such as a trade-off between speed and accuracy, or whether the decision will end in deadlock. These studies can provide a mechanistic understanding of how these complex collective behaviors enable the prediction of specific dynamics and outcomes. This approach is not only reserved for animal studies. For example, this research method has been applied to the study of human crowd behavior. Individual-based social force models have been used to model and predict crowd dynamics. Real-world behaviors such as lane formation can be measured and analyzed and linked back to models. And the progression of navigational decision-making can even be studied over time through the continuous tracking of individual movements. While this approach has been successfully applied to crowd behavior, its application to collective intelligence is more difficult due to the need to link vocal interactions to the progression of group outcomes over time. Luckily, this problem falls well within my research area. My research focuses on the connection between communication and collective behavior in species ranging from frogs to chimpanzees. Notably, I've developed and used continuous tracking technology to study the connection between communication and the collective movement behavior and decision-making of goats and baboons. For example, I've studied how lost calls regulate group cohesion in free-ranging goats, as well as the role contact calls play in the coordination of departure in wild baboons. And I'm now applying my unique background and skill set towards the study of collective intelligence in human teams. Particularly, I recently wrote a review paper on how advances in this area can be made by studying this topic from the perspective of swarm intelligence. My work is examining the following research questions through the use of both empirical studies and theoretical models. How do individual traits impact speaking patterns? How does a team's trait composition shape its communication dynamics? And how do communication dynamics shape team outcomes? By understanding how individual traits and speaking behaviors combine to shape conversation dynamics, and how properties of these dynamics impact the combination of knowledge, ideas, and perspectives, we can gain a detailed understanding of the scaffolding upon which collective intelligence is built. And for the remainder of this talk, I'm going to briefly describe our recent progress on this third area. So I'm collaborating with a multidisciplinary team of researchers in the area of psychological sciences, biological sciences, and engineering, with many of our projects centered on the topic of engineering design. Our team is developing and using remote sensing technology to continuously measure verbal and nonverbal behaviors throughout the teamwork process through the use of observational studies of real-world teams and experiments in the lab. Unfortunately, right now is not the best time to be studying in-person social interactions. We're currently in the process of shifting our studies towards the study of virtual teams. And so I'm actually only going to be presenting preliminary data since the experiments we had begun earlier in the semester have been cut off unexpectedly. So I'm going to provide an overview of one of the tasks that we're using and some preliminary results from this task. So it involves a simple online design tool that also has an objective performance measure. And the goal is to design a solution to maximize performance as specified by the researchers. It involves an individual brainstorming phase where individuals come up with their own solutions to the challenge on their own. And then a subsequent team decision-making phase where the individuals come together and work together as a team to come up with a team solution to the problem. In addition to these team trials, we also ran solitary trials where individuals had an initial brainstorming phase, and then they had a longer period equivalent to the team phase where they could elaborate upon their initial solution. We're currently conducting studies with 3-person teams, and we have plans to elaborate and extend group size in the future. So the value of our task is that we can use it to study how conversation facilitates the conversion of individual inputs to team solutions by extracting data on both the performance and design of these solutions. And so as individuals are designing them, they do not have access to performance information, so they're not allowed to test them through the design process. So we're able to study processes of influence between team members during this process. We're first testing whether our study facilitates the emergence of collective intelligence. So do teams perform better than individuals on this task? We found that in the solitary trials, there was no difference in the median values of performance between the initial design phase and the final design phase. When we look at the team trials, we see a significant increase in performance between the initial individual phase and then the subsequent team design phase. So during the period when the individuals could come together and work on their solution together. So this box plot here is representing the median solution performance value for each team. And then this is showing the maximum performance value for each team during the individual phase. And we see that for when we are looking at the best solution to this challenge, the median team outcome was not better than in the team phase than in the individual phase, though we did see a reduction in variance. This may suggest that team members are towards their peak of their performance on this particular task, and we're currently working on creating more complex design challenges to present to these teams. And if we look in detail at how these designs changed over time, so this is the performance of each team's best individual in the initial phase compared to the team's performance in the team phase. We see that individuals that did not perform well during the initial phase had a very large increase in performance during the team phase, while individuals that performed well during the initial phase, well, teams that had those individuals did not perform too differently during the team phase. And so our goal is to gain insight into how teams' interactions relate to the patterns of collective intelligence that they display. So just one example of how we can do this once we collect more data is that we can examine the difference between each individual's design in their initial solutions to the design of the team solutions. So if we compare the distance between the design of, for instance, the top speaker, so the individual who spoke the most, and the design of the individual who had the best solution, we can try to see which of these patterns may play a more important role in who gains more influence over the final team solution. So if points fall in this section, it indicates that individuals with the best solution had more influence over decision making. Or if they fall in this area, individuals that were speaking more had more influence. This is just where our initial points fell. We had a lot of points on this line, which indicates that the final team solution best matched the solution of the team member that was both the top speaker and had the best solution. So if we look at speaking behaviors by their relative team solution, we see that individuals that had the best initial solution had a tendency to speak more than expected, while that was not seen for individuals that had the worst solution. And while it may be good that individuals with good solutions are talking more, we do not always see these patterns. For instance, in studies of observational studies of teamwork that we've conducted previously, we found that native English speakers spoke significantly more than non-native speakers, and these dynamics can be counterproductive for collective intelligence. So in summary, I'm studying how individual traits impact speaking patterns, how a team's trait composition shapes its communication dynamics, and how communication dynamics impact team outcomes. And the value of our approach is that we can understand and predict group dynamics, leadership emergence, collective intelligence, and performance, with the aim of targeted interventions to improve teamwork. And my long-term research goals are to better understand and engineer the social dynamics of successfully functioning groups, do basic research on non-human and human collective behaviors, an application towards improving the functioning of human groups, teams, and societies. Thank you.
Hi, my name is Iyad Rahwan. I'm at the Max Planck Institute for Human Development. I'm the director of the Center for Humans and Machines, which is a new center we're establishing here in Berlin. I'll talk to you today about extreme crowdsourcing. And I'm very interested basically in collective intelligence at its limits. And in particular, I want to talk to you about 5 different projects that I was involved in one way or another over the past 10 years. And I'll provide a very quick overview of them, as well as some of the lessons that we've learned from those experiences. So the story starts in 2009 with balloons. In particular, the DARPA Network Challenge, which some of you may be aware of. This is a challenge that was designed to test the limits of social media at the time, which were very much ill understood at the time. The challenge required people to use any means necessary to find 10 weather balloons that would be tethered at 10 random locations all over the continental United States. A team from M.I.T, led by Sandy Pentland, found those 10 balloons in less than 9 hours, winning the prize. And they did this by mobilizing people on social media and using a clever incentive scheme, which rewarded not only the people who find the balloons, but also people who recruit the people who found the balloons, or the people who recruited those people, and so on. I was fortunate enough to be involved in the analysis of this of data from this challenge, and we learned a bunch of things. One of the most interesting things we learned is the important role of super mobilizers. So these are people who can mobilize a disproportionate number of others, and they help keep the campaign going, even when the reproductive number, so to speak, is less than 1. So this is kind of similar to the idea of super spreaders in viral pandemics, for instance. We also did some subsequent simulation studies in which we tried to understand to what extent was success in the DARPA Network Challenge feasible. And indeed, we find that it is feasible if you could repeat it under different conditions, although there were a small space within the parameter space that actually allows for something like this to happen. Another thing we learned was the role of misinformation. So you can see here the 10 balloons, the actual locations of the balloons in blue. You could see in red all of the information that was submitted to the M.I.T team. You could see that it's all over the place, including even in Canada, which was not even part of the challenge. And this was perhaps in part mistaken sightings, but also deliberate sabotage. So there were other teams that were submitting false pictures with false geolocation. They were even photoshopping pictures, and even after discovering that each balloon was manned by a different DARPA official wearing this yellow vest, some of the competitive teams were faking those kind of pictures with including the yellow vest itself. So I think dealing with misinformation has been an extremely important thing that we realized very early on as we were interested in collective intelligence. And this is something obviously that has become a very important phenomenon today. The second challenge is called the tag challenge, and it has to do with finding people. So this time you have to find individuals in a given city by 8 p.m. Using just a mugshot. I led a team that used a similar incentive scheme. This is in collaboration with Manuel Cebrian, who was part of the Red Balloon Challenge team. And we found people using, again, social media. And in fact, out of the 5 targets, we found 3 of them by the deadline. And again, we had some sabotage attempts, people sending us viruses, for instance. And subsequently, we also ran simulations to try to come up with plausible models of the dynamics of the social recruitments that led to success in this kind of challenge. And again, we find that it's pretty much at the limit of what can be achieved, finding people, namely within 12 hours. So these, the first two challenges have to do with search through physical space for objects or individuals. The third project has to do with search through combinatorial space. So this was a challenge organized by DARPA again, which shredded documents using increasingly powerful industrial shredders. They scanned all the pieces and made them available for teams to assemble. Now, Manuel, who had my collaborator from the first two challenges, had moved to UC San Diego at the time, and he assembled a team that built a platform to enable people to, hundreds of people to simultaneously assemble these shredded pieces together. And indeed, it worked. It was the only team that was using crowdsourcing in a serious manner. Other teams were using computer vision techniques. And this is the second puzzle assembled. And one of the things we learned in our subsequent analysis of the data is that a lot of the progress is driven by a very few number of people. So there are basically a small group of, even though there is a big crowd, there is a small group of committed individuals that really do the bulk of the work. And as the puzzles get harder and harder, this inequality in contribution actually increases. But as the story again goes, sabotage was inevitable because the system was open. This is cumulative progress in the puzzle number 4, after which the team never recovered. So this is one challenge that was not won by crowdsourcing. And as you can see here, that the saboteur was even taunting the UC San Diego team by sending them messages about exactly what he did. And I say he because Wired magazine actually wrote a story, an interview with him, and they gave him a pseudonym, Adam, in which they, and in this interview, they tried to get to the bottom of the motivation behind this. So if you're interested in the story, I would point you to the Wired magazine article. Then I want to move to a more recent project, which has to do with whether we can use collective intelligence and crowdsourcing to control a real-time avatar that's moving in a physical world. And this avatar could be simulated by a human, for instance. The project is called Me. It was run by Niccolo Pescetelli, who was my postdoc at the time at MIT. And it was in part inspired by a Black Mirror episode in which this character played by John Hamm was advising somebody in real time during a physical date, a romantic date with somebody. So he had a video feed, so he was seeing what the person was seeing. He was giving him advice and suggestions about how to conduct himself in the date. But there was also a crowd of people that were watching the whole ensuing activities and were making suggestions to John Hamm as well. So John Hamm was giving his own advice, but also in some way integrating information from others. So that's kind of the same structure of the Me experiment, which had this, a couple of human avatars who were moving around the MIT campus to complete a fictitious task. And there was an operator in the control room that was communicating with the avatar, with the agent, through a video link. The operator was receiving a live feed, but also able to communicate directly. But the operator was also aggregating information from online users that were suggesting actions for the avatar. And we have a paper coming out in IEEE Computer soon, in which we describe the experience as well as the system. And we also describe how fairly simple natural language processing techniques could actually automate to a large extent the function of this operator. So they're able to, we can show that we can reasonably aggregate these kind of free-form discussions from the crowd. If you want to learn a bit more about that too, the less scientific side of the project, you could also watch this documentary that was directed by Niccolo. And finally, I want to talk about a different kind of challenge, which is how do we search through, how do we use collective intelligence to crowdsource ethical trade-offs in a high-dimensional space. So we looked at autonomous cars, and the backdrop is that the introduction of autonomous cars can help eliminate a large proportion of traffic fatalities today, because 90% or more of fatalities are caused by human error, which is in principle avoidable by machines. But despite this enthusiasm, a lot of people are terrified of allowing AI systems to make life and death decisions in dilemma scenarios, no matter how rare those dilemma scenarios are. And the dilemma scenario that has captured the public imagination is inspired by the trolley problem. And it looks like this. The car is about to crash into a group of pedestrians, but it can swerve and kill just one person on the sidewalk. And the question is whether the car should be allowed to do that, or whether the programmers should program this behavior in anticipation of this scenario. And another scenario is that the car would sacrifice its own passenger to save the greater number of people. Now, we could have a long argument about, in a different talk, about whether this is realistic. Obviously, it's an abstraction, but I do believe that it's an abstraction of a more realistic statistical problem that has to do something with allocation of statistical risk on the road. Nevertheless, we initially ran some studies, some kind of traditional psychological studies using subjects from a Mechanical Turk. And we found some interesting things, like people wouldn't buy a self-sacrificing car. However, they want everybody else to do so because they want to live in a world in which the cars will always minimize harm, even if that means sacrificing the passenger. But that was just one dimension. That was saving basically more people versus less people. We were interested in trade-offs involved in this kind of scenario. This is why we built the Moral Machine website, which presents these kinds of dilemmas, multidimensional dilemmas, to people and asks them to choose which outcome of two really bad outcomes they prefer or they dislike least. So in this case, we varied not just the number of potential victims, but also various characteristics of them, such as age, whether they were human or dogs. We vary whether an outcome is the result of omission or commission by the car, whether there is a traffic violation by somebody crossing illegally, and so on. And things really add up quickly, because just with this small factorial design, fairly simple cartoonish scenario, you end up with 26 million possible dilemmas, which is really infeasible by conventional psychological experimental methods. The questions look things like this: would the car swerve to kill two pedestrians to save its occupants? And more people would seem to prefer the car to go straight. A lot of people prefer the car to kill an adult, swerve to kill an adult to save a child. They also prefer the car to kill a jaywalker to save a person who's done nothing wrong. When you start adding, combining things or creating trade-offs between different values, for example, killing two people who are crossing illegally to save one person crossing legally, then things get a little bit more difficult. So thanks to some traditional media, but also some more modern YouTubers who have been playing the game and recording themselves, we managed to amass 40 million decisions from 4 million people worldwide. And we got fairly broad coverage of the entire planet as a result. We also translated the website to all the major languages, many of the major languages. And this helped us quantify the relative importance of different factors that people consider should be taken into account. And there's a whole, we can have a whole discussion about these. But what I want to focus on here is that because we were able to collect such a large amount of data, we were able to conduct an analysis at the level of countries, individual countries, and compare those countries. So you could look at the global average, the global effect sizes of these different factors, and then you can compare specific countries to them or pairs of countries. So you can see here, for example, that Germany and China look very different in terms of certain factors. And we're able to also cluster countries based on the similarities and differences between their ethical preferences. And this, surprisingly, this clustering actually mirrors a lot of well-known anthropological theories. And even quantifying like the differences between the clusters shows some really interesting patterns. So let me close by talking about some lessons from all of these attempts at extreme crowdsourcing. I would say the first one is that the crowds can do a lot in the real world, not just online, in the virtual world. Also, gaming the system is really inevitable. It's something that we've seen in many, many cases. And it's kind of almost a function of this openness of the system. It's important to harness cooperative instincts and incentives, but also curiosity and people's just desire to learn something about themselves, for example, about their own ethical values. It's important to cater for active participants who make disproportionate contribution. We also learned that complex real-time coordination maybe is feasible, but may even be automatable as well. And finally, the moral machine experiment has taught us that high-dimensional long-term experimentation is feasible if you could gamify something, an experiment like this. So if you're interested in more details about any of those projects, here's a list of papers. And I would like to thank you again for listening and be happy to take questions later on.
So I'd like to talk today about some examples about how the COVID-19 pandemic is affecting collective intelligence in the real world, and how collective intelligence can in turn help us respond to that real world pandemic. First, I think one of the most important ways COVID-19 is affecting real world collective intelligence is by dramatically accelerating some changes that were happening anyway, but that would probably otherwise have taken much longer. In a sense, I think the pandemic is like a bullet train to the future. For over 3 decades, I've studied and written about the effects of digital communication on business, society, and other forms of collective intelligence. And some of the changes I thought would take a decade or more happened in a few weeks in March and April. For instance, almost everyone in America who has a job that can be done remotely has been working from home. And many people are discovering that they really can do much of their job from a distance. Of course, when lots of other things in society are disrupted too, like schools being closed, this doesn't always work out perfectly. But for many people, it's working better than they would have expected. And I think many people are asking themselves, why do we really need to commute an hour a day to meet with people who we can already see and talk to electronically? Of course, sometimes face-to-face meetings are necessary. And when things go back to, quote, normal, we'll probably go back to having some of these meetings. But I think many people will be surprised at how often, once we're used to doing it, many jobs really can be done from anywhere. And that means more and more people will make decisions about where they live, not based on where their job is, but on what they want to be close to outside of work, whether that's beaches, mountains, or the excitement of the city. Now, this clearly has implications for real estate. For instance, I think it's likely that expensive urban office space like this will be less valuable in the future. But I think many people will probably still won't want to work in their own homes. So among other things, I think we're likely to see a new kind of office become much more common, what I call neighborhood office buildings. For instance, think of suburbs where every block or two, there's a former house converted into office space. Maybe this building, for instance, would be converted into workspaces for 6 or 7 people who had different jobs, working for different companies, but who all shared a coffee machine, a chance to socialize with each other, and a commute consisting of a 2-minute walk from their nearby houses. Now, in addition to changing where we'll work, I think as we get used to doing more and more work online, the work we'll do will change too. In my recent book, Superminds, I gave dozens of examples of kinds of collective intelligence that I think are likely to become much more common in the future. For example, many of the people in this collective intelligence community have been talking for years about things like prediction markets, crowdsourcing, and online democracies, and many more. For instance, another example, when many tasks can be done from anywhere on the planet, new kinds of hyper-specialization become possible. One person, for example, might be a hyper-specialist only in answering arcane questions from accountants all over the country about how to treat business entertainment expenses. Someone else who specializes in multiple areas might spend the morning evaluating the feasibility of pieces of Apple's strategic plan, in the afternoon estimating the probability that specific individuals are planning terrorist attacks in, say, Yemen. So I think these are all examples of new kinds of collective intelligence that would probably have happened anyway, but that I think are likely to happen much sooner because of the pandemic. Now let's talk about how we can use collective intelligence to deal with the real COVID-19 pandemic. Of course, there's lots we could say about this, but I want to give you 3 examples of things we've been working on in the MIT Center for Collective Intelligence that I think could be useful. The first is something called the Pandemic Response Collab, which we just publicly launched yesterday, as a matter of fact. My primary collaborators on this project include David Sun Kong, Kathleen Kennedy, and Annalyn Bachman. And our focus here is on crowdsourcing as a form of collective intelligence, building on our experience with Climate Collab, where we have over 120,000 registered members developing and evaluating proposals for what to do about global climate change. But in this new project, we're focusing on the project of how to respond to the COVID pandemic. At the center of the project will be a variety of challenges like this one about designing masks and other face coverings to optimize things like wearability, comfort, and style. And in this challenge, we expect to draw on the diverse kinds of knowledge in the general public to come up with innovative answers to these questions. There will also be more technical challenges like this one on how to use innovative materials and other technologies to enhance the functionality of face coverings in different settings. And here we expect to draw on a crowd of people with much more specialized technical knowledge than in challenges like the first one I showed. Now, as many of you know, challenges like these have been common in a number of other open innovation platforms for years. And we think it's important to apply them to one of the most critical problems our world is facing today. But in this project, we're also focusing on crowdsourcing 2 other kinds of challenges that, as far as we know, haven't been used before in the context of open innovation platforms. The first kind of challenge of this type is about finding and defining what are the important problems to solve in the first place. Here, for example, is a problem finding challenge where a number of people have already entered problems that they think are important that are related to the pandemic. Some of these are widely shared problems, like how to develop personal protective equipment for agricultural workers. Others might be very specific, like how to provide groceries to seniors sheltering in place in a particular retirement community in, say, Lowell, Massachusetts. So you could think of these problem-finding challenges as upstream challenges ahead of the main problem-solving challenges. And we also expect to have downstream challenges to help find people and other resources to implement good solutions that emerge from the problem-solving stage. For instance, one of these downstream challenges might help recruit volunteers to deliver groceries to the retirement community in Lowell, Massachusetts, we just talked about. So together, we hope these three types of challenges will help harness new kinds of collective intelligence to solve important problems like, for example, what to do about the pandemic. The next idea I want to talk about is based on an op-ed I recently published about how to deal with the massive unemployment caused by the pandemic. The basic idea is to use a new digital version of something like a program created by the US government after the Great Depression in the 1930s. The original program was called the Works Progress Administration, or WPA, and the WPA provided government-funded jobs for millions of unemployed workers, mostly building roads, hospitals, and other kinds of public infrastructure. Today, we have an option that wasn't available then. That is to create a digital WPA, where the work is digital, not physical. That means the work can be done from anywhere, so it can still be done even if we have to continue or reinstate some form of social distancing for an indefinitely long time. And it even provides a bridge from unemployment today to the digital jobs of tomorrow. Many of the workers in such a digital WPA could do tasks that are desperately needed to cope with the pandemic, like tracking the contacts of people who are infected, or coordinating care for homebound seniors. They could also do lots of other kinds of work, like monitoring security cameras in government buildings, converting medical records to electronic form, or doing all kinds of other collective intelligence tasks that I think people in this community could come up with. And wouldn't it be better if we could pay people to do urgent, socially important work like some of these things, instead of just paying them for being unemployed? One of the key collective intelligence problems to be solved in doing this is how to match workers to work. And one intriguing possibility for that, I think, is to use the kind of online labor markets that many people in this community know a lot about, like Mechanical Turk, Upwork, and others, to do this matching. Now, of course, a digital WPA isn't a panacea for all our unemployment problems. People in the 1930s sometimes joked that WPA stood for We Poke Along, because they felt the WPA employees didn't work very hard. And it won't be trivial to determine the right mix of pay levels and work requirements to motivate workers while still providing incentives for the workers to return to the private sector when they can. And in this government-supported version of a gig economy, it will also be important to avoid creating digital sweatshops, and instead to provide livable incomes and reasonable working conditions for the workers. But it certainly seems that something like a digital WPA could be a very powerful treatment for the massive unemployment this pandemic is causing. Now, the last thing I'd like to talk about today is how the pandemic may accelerate our progress in overcoming a limitation in today's video conferencing tools. As we're all experiencing in this conference today, Zoom and other video conferencing systems are already very good for many kinds of scheduled meetings, from 2 people to hundreds of people. These tools aren't always as good as in-person meetings, but they're often close and sometimes even better. But as many of us have also experienced, there's at least one very important thing that these tools don't do well, and that is supporting the ad hoc private conversations people often have before a meeting, after a meeting, or in the breaks of a meeting. It's long seemed obvious to me, and probably to many of you, that it should be possible to support this kind of ad hoc interaction online too. And about 6 weeks ago, I realized there was a pretty simple way to do that. So Jae-Yoon Sung, an incoming MIT PhD student, and I started working on software to do that. We recently added Chris Riedel to the team to focus on data analysis. And as I should have known, it didn't turn out to be as easy as I thought. But I'm very happy to say that we managed to get a system working in beta test form in time to use at this conference. And you'll all be able to try it out starting in the next break in just a few minutes. The system is called Mingler, and it tries to replicate many aspects of the kind of ad hoc conversations we all might have in the lobby if we were here in person instead of online. Here's how it works. On the left, you see a list of people at the conference who are available to talk, and you can select ones you want to talk to. In the middle, you see who else, if anyone, is waiting for the people you wanted to talk to. And on the right, you see the people who want to talk to you. If you select one of them, then both of you go into a private video room where you can talk for as long or as short a time as you want. The software uses an open source video conferencing system called Jitsi. And for those of you who are interested in using or contributing to Mingler after this conference, we're planning to make it available soon as open source software. And we would welcome users of the system and developers of the software to join. We'll also send a survey to all of you after the conference to learn more about your experiences in using Mingler. Now, my hope and expectation is that some version of this basic functionality will be useful in very many situations, not just academic conferences, but also business meetings, classes, parties, and many other professional and social events. So I expect that some version of this functionality will eventually be implemented in all the major video conferencing systems. But you have a chance to use it here today. Now, why is this important for collective intelligence? From a collective intelligence point of view, lots of research suggests that the kind of random ad hoc encounters that tools like Mingler will support online are often key to creative innovations in cities, research labs, companies, and lots of other places. And from our own personal experiences, we also know that these ad hoc interactions can often be critical to building social connections and a feeling of bonding and camaraderie in a group. In fact, I think these kinds of ad hoc interactions are among the most important things people miss in today's work from home environment. And as Mingler shows, new technologies could help provide these things online too. So I think this online mingling is another example of how the pandemic is accelerating us, like on a bullet train, into a future where much richer kinds of online interactions will be key to our social engagement, our collective intelligence, and I hope our collective wisdom. Thank you.
Let's enter the Q&A portion of this. I'm going to moderate the questions that have been asked on Pigeonhole, roughly just going in order of number of votes. So if you haven't voted or if you haven't asked your question, get that in there sooner rather than later. Let's start out with a question for Iyad. So the question is, do either or both, potentially the first two projects you presented, have any implications for contact tracing during a pandemic? Certainly a topically relevant question, or temporally relevant.
Yeah, that's a good question.
as it happens, actually, my collaborator on these two projects wrote one of the very first contact tracing papers back in 2014, I think. I do think that they are relevant in the sense that you could potentially use incentive schemes that encourage recruitment for not just installing an app for contact tracing, but also for recruiting others, both to install the app, but also perhaps to share their data with other people, and perhaps to create some sort of social reward system that keeps people sort of motivated to keep doing this. So I haven't thought about the details, but I think it's a really nice idea. So whoever asked that question should definitely do it.
Great. All right, so the next question is for Tom. What are the main challenges that in your mind need to be addressed to harness the full potential of collective intelligence?
So that's certainly a big question. In some sense, you could say this whole conference is the answer to that question. I guess maybe the question is asking just for my personal opinions about what are some of the most important things or some of the most promising things.
Yeah.
I think part of what, in some sense, inspired this whole conference series is the idea that while collective intelligence in many forms involving humans and other biological entities and so forth, while it's existed for millennia, in some sense almost forever, I think the new technologies we have, especially for communication and also in many cases for computation, those new technologies are enabling some really new kinds of collective intelligence to be feasible and often very powerful. I think that's one of the most interesting things from my point of view is how these new technologies can enable new kinds of collective intelligence that were never possible before. Another thing I would point to as one that I think is often hard to get right and that we often overlook is incentives. It's pretty easy to think of new kinds of collective intelligence that would be cool and sure people maybe could do them, but motivating people to do them is often a much harder question. So I think that's a pretty important thing too. So there's many other things we could say, but those are at least two starters of things that I think are important.
Great, thank you. And yeah, it always makes me think, you know, in your discussion of incentives in this kind of digital WPA, you know, incentives always have this dual nature. It's incentivizing, but it's also rewarding, you know, that effort and contribution. So it's kind of fair pay for work, whether that's, you know, for-profit work or just contributions in the types we saw in all the presentations. So for Lisa now, there was a question about in your studies, will you consider things like body language and eye contact and other kinds of nonverbal communication in how you're thinking about this team performance?
Yes, we are. Though this area is falling with some of my engineering collaborators. So for example, they're working on measuring body movements so that they can estimate eye gaze and also overall body movements during some of our tasks. And some of our tasks actually involve physical movements. And so we can study both vocal contributions and physical contributions to the teamwork.
Awesome, sounds really exciting. Okay, back to Iyad for a second. The next question is again, you know, you're hitting on very, very temporally relevant issues. So did you have a particular strategy for dealing with misinformation in the studies that you talked about?
Unfortunately, there was nothing really systematic. It was so all of these challenges were fairly time critical. So there was like a deadline, and we had to move fast. And you know, it already was, I think, an accomplishment to be able to build the systems in time to do these things. So we couldn't really anticipate all of the possible ways in which people could attack the system. So I would say there was much more ad hoc reactions. So blocking things, stopping people from entering the system, from new signups. I mean, for the Shredder challenge, it took us 2 years to actually find how exactly the attack happened and whether you could have detected like the signature of the attack earlier. Until it took us a while to analyze the data. So I think in retrospect, one can now go back and use some of these findings from the papers to introduce some of these early detection approaches. I think it's something that long-running projects like Wikipedia, for example, are very good at because they've had time to adapt. But in a time-critical project of this nature, I think it's much harder. So you use like whiteboards to corroborate numbers or things like that, much more low-tech.
It sounds like a compelling open problem. But great. Let's see, we have time for a couple more questions. I'm going to go back to Lisa. So there's this question about is the reduction in variance between individuals and teams a result of there being fewer teams? So you're kind of grouping people into sets. Does that imbalance play a role in what you observed?
So I think maybe there was a little confusion. So the boxes that were comparing the initial solutions and the final outcomes for the individuals that were in teams were only including one individual per team. So it was either the median individual for the first one I showed, or the best individual in the second one I showed. So both those boxes contain the same number of points.
Great. Okay. So that was controlled for. That sounds great. Let's see if anything else has been re-ranked here. So I'm trying to see if there's some intersection between some of these questions and maybe make it a more open-ended question to the panel here. So there's a number of the later questions that ask about how interactions or incentives can be used to kind of guide crowds and collective processes, as well as some of the capabilities. I wonder if there's anything that any of the three speakers wanted to add about maybe some of the intersections you see between your own talks and where either these guidance mechanisms or the capabilities overlap, and if you wanted to add anything there before we go to the first break. I'll let anyone just jump in. So this is the more traditional panel. We'll see if we can do this online.
Well, if you want, I'll ad lib something. I see one of the questions is about whether crowd and collective intelligence can filter out fake news. That's a question I've thought about, and I think the answer depends on what you mean by fake news. If by fake you mean things that most people in a community think is wrong, then crowds can absolutely do that. The problem is almost everything we believe is real is based on what other people we respect tell us is real and true. You know, is George Washington the first president of the United States? Well, we believe it because lots of people we trust said it ever since we were little. But in fact, there actually is some debate about how you would define the term first president of the United States. And there's someone else, John something or other, who has a claim to it also. So I think if a problem, in fact, it is a problem with what we're talking about as fake news, is that when a broad community becomes segmented into smaller sub-communities who have very different ideas about what's true in the first place, those communities can do a good job of filtering out fake news from the point of view of each community. But if you don't even trust the other community's views about what's fake, then they probably can't do a good job of filtering out what you think is fake. Right. Yeah, that becomes a tricky problem, and we're out of time. We need to go to the break here, but just to kind of add a little bit of connection there, you know, I wonder how, Lisa, your work on teams intersects with these types of issues when we're all broken up into little community working groups that are more localized. And now the people I bump into in the hallway is this very small set of people who might not agree with the office on 2 blocks over. So do we get more fracture, or is that kind of alleviating because we're not doing the same type of naturalistic grouping?
Oh yeah, no, that's a great question. I think just studying how this situation as a whole is impacting these dynamics is just a whole another research area. I saw one of the questions was related to how do like virtual interactions affect some of these interaction processes, and that's kind of another aspect of all of this that we're definitely thinking about right now. So we don't have answers to that question, but we're definitely thinking about ways that we can kind of expand on these topics in the future.
Very cool. All right,
Yeah.
so thanks again to all the speakers in this session. We are going to try out this Mingler tool for the upcoming break here. Chris, did you have any other announcements before we launch into that about the mechanics?
Maybe if we could share the link to the Mingler.
Yeah, I was going to say, Tom, do we have the information shared?
I actually have had two announcements I'm supposed to make now. One is about Mingler, but the other one is about another topic. Let's see, are you seeing my screen shared yet?
We are, yeah.
Okay, so actually it gave away the punchlines for this first slide because if you saw it before I put it as full screen. But the first announcement I have to make is about the conference chair and vocation for Collective Intelligence 2021. I'm happy to announce that Torben Jewel Anderson will be the conference chair for next year's Collective Intelligence Conference. It will be held in Copenhagen unless we're unable to do so for various reasons, in which case there will also be a virtual contingency plan. And the dates will be June 29th and 30th. So I very much hope to see all of you next year in Copenhagen or wherever for Collective Intelligence 2021. The other thing I want to do is tell you a little more about how to use Mingler starting in just a minute. All you really need to do is go to the website mingler.info. So when you get to that website, there'll be things you can click on to log in and use the system. You saw what it looked like on my slides a few minutes ago. Remember that this is a beta test. We've only been working on this system for about 6 weeks. It's likely that some of you will have some problems getting it to work, but we hope that many of you will have a chance to experience this new capability for ad hoc private conversations. One thing that would help to know is that the system works best with the Chrome browser, unless you're using iOS, in which case you should use Safari. And if you need technical help in the course of this, there is a link on the mingler.info page where you can get some technical help as well. So here we go. Looking forward to seeing all of you in Mingler.